The other day, my dad came to have coffee with me in my garden. He was delighted at how overgrown the flowers were, and he said, "It's like you have your own secret garden back here." He also brought me some strange flying saucer candies that he bought from the British shop. They were like communion wafers filled with powdered fizzy sugar. At first I hated them, but before I knew it, I had eaten them all. It got me thinking about how weird and mysterious England is to someone who's only experienced it through media, and how that strange land really shaped my childhood and my imagination. That night, I got cozy with a snack and decided to revisit one of the first movies that transported me there, the 1993 movie, The Secret Garden. I haven't watched it since I was a child. I think my attention was stolen away by more action-packed media franchises, like Harry Potter. I think the magical elements were a lot more subtle in The Secret Garden, which I didn't really appreciate until I grew up and the possibilities of encountering magic seemed to fade away, and I had to remind myself to look for it in the ordinary everyday world. This movie is based on the 1911 Frances Hodgson Burnett novel of the same name, and the book very much deserves its place in the pantheon of classic children's literature. It's really beautifully written. It's sort of an introduction to the Gothic novel. There's an air of mystery with a big, creepy old house and potentially supernatural atmosphere. But I want to talk specifically about the 1993 movie, which was an early introduction to things like British period dramas and classic literature, which opened the door to my love of Jane Eyre and the romantic idea of wandering the foggy moors, which I pretended to do, but in drainage ditches at the side of the road with a blanket draped around my shoulders like a cape. I had to get creative in finding this movie, because Amazon Prime claimed to have it, but it was just the wrong thumbnail and information, and was actually some low-budget 2017 steampunk reimagining of The Secret Garden, not the classic 93 one that I was looking for. It can be so infuriating to try and find specific movies these days, across all the stupid streaming services. It was so much easier when this movie was on VHS, and the most annoying thing was if I forgot to rewind it. I've just gone back to collecting media now. I'm so tired of not having things all together anymore, and paying out the nose for the same old garbage. This way, I'm not scrolling endlessly as my dinner gets cold. Anyway, let's get back to the movie. There will be spoilers, but don't let that stop you from watching this movie if you haven't, or haven't in a long time. I don't think that knowing the plot will take anything away from the movie, but that's completely up to you. The heroine of The Secret Garden is Mary Lennox, a little girl raised in colonial India by servants, because her parents are too busy and rich and important to take care of her themselves. I used to think that she was a really ungrateful crab, and that bothered me, because I would have gladly traded lives with her. But as an adult, I think her sullen moodiness is honestly come by. The girl who plays her, Kate Maberly, does such an amazing job. I love her facial expressions. Mary, as a little neglected girl, had never learned to cry. She's orphaned when her parents get squished in an earthquake, and she is sent to Yorkshire, to her uncle, Lord Craven's house, practically an old castle, called Misselthwaite Manor. Maggie Smith is the housekeeper, Mrs. Medlock, who is sort of responsible for Mary. She is the closest thing in the film to an antagonist, but really most of the grown-ups are antagonists, or certainly cold and unhelpful. She is perfectly cast, as are all of the actors in this movie. The film has fantastic atmosphere. It's a really cozy watch, and one of my earliest comfort watches, though there were some parts that I always used to fast forward through, which I'll explain later on. Misselthwaite Manor really is its own character, which is essential in any Gothic or haunted house type story. It has beautiful carvings and tapestry and walled gardens and grounds. Some of it feels very old and medieval, and there are even some stone ruins all overgrown inside the secret garden itself. The costumes and soundtrack really make this movie, and Roger Deakins was the cinematographer. He shot The Shawshank Redemption and Fargo and so many classic movies. He really frames this magical story in a way that feels like a fairy tale. At first, it almost feels like the big old house is watching Mary. Mary's uncle, Lord Archibald Craven, is a real piece of work. He's supposed to be a hideous hunchback, cursed by immeasurable grief. He barely even has a hump, though. It's more just gamer posture. He lost his wife, who fell off a swing, and he never recovered. My big gripe with this story is how he gets a pass for being a neglectful parent. Mrs. Medlock is portrayed as the bad guy because she was in charge of the children, but she's just a housekeeper, and it probably wasn't even in the job description. Not every woman is automatically nurturing. But Lord Craven is so sad, and he can't even bear to be around his own son. So he's always off on some emo vacation. By the end of the movie, he comes to his senses and realizes what he's done.
Abandoned my child. Say it louder. Say it louder. I've abandoned my child! I've abandoned my child! I've abandoned my boy!
And I'm sure the children will forgive him, but I won't. They come to the conclusion that he is cursed and needs magical intervention, because children may not always be sweet, but they are innocent. Which brings me to Colin Craven. Colin is Mary's cousin, who cries all the time, and who everyone pretends is just the wind or some dogs outside. I always hated the dismissive way grown-ups would just wave away my questions. Because I said so is never an acceptable answer. Obviously, like the clever little girl that she is, Mary doesn't believe that the crying that she hears at night is nothing, and she goes to investigate, discovering that she has a cousin living right down the hall. Now, as a kid, I absolutely hated Colin. He was way worse than Draco Malfoy, just spoiled and whiny and a real creep. But as an adult, I feel really sad for him. Of course he acts out. This is what happens to a neglected child who feels so abandoned and out of control of his own life, who is told from a young age that he's just going to die at any moment, and has to stay in bed until he does. His father is so caught up in his own grief. He's the equivalent of that "I can't even adult today" meme. Sir, you are a parent. He never considers what Colin must be going through, living without his mother. He is just as much an orphan as Mary, and on top of the neglect is the medical abuse. As a kid, I always had to fast forward the scenes where Colin was being treated with ice baths and electric shocks. It really upset me. I could see modern critics theorizing about Colin being a victim of Munchausen's by proxy or something, and maybe if it was remade again, we would see him get some kind of modern revenge against his father and Mrs. Medlock like Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad these poor children managed to get their happy ending, but it's just hard to endure their suffering. Though maybe it's a kindness that they don't understand the cruelty of the world, and their minds chose to interpret it as a curse that could be lifted. Real life rarely gets wrapped up so nicely. But The Secret Garden is about finding light and beauty in the harsh world despite these traumas. There are good people here too, even if it is just Dickon and his sister, the young maid Martha. I had a real crush on Dickon when I was little. I really needed a friend like him. He is a kind and gentle local boy who hangs around Misselthwaite Manor, along with his animal companions. He is patient and understanding with Mary and Colin. He knows what they've been through, and he understands that like wild animals, they are likely to lash out at an outstretched hand before they learn to trust it. I wish that all of us wounded creatures can find a Dickon out there one day, or that we can learn to become truly kind and patient with the other damaged people, which, let's be real, these days is most people. Rewatching this movie really did something to me. I'm not going to lie, I cried a lot. I cried when Mary was waiting alone to be picked up. I cried when the robin chose to be Mary's friend. I cried when the garden started blooming and the music got all magical. And I especially cried at the end, when Lord Craven tells Mary that she has brought them all back to life. I think it really hit a nerve. I was alone a lot as a child. I don't have any siblings, and we didn't even have the internet until the mid-2000s. I lived in a small house in the country with no other kids around to play with. I remember vividly being so jealous of Mary Lennox it almost made me sick. She had Dickon and his animals and servants to bring her hot meals and cups of tea, not to mention a beautiful, mysterious house with secret passages to explore. And she didn't even have to go to school. I'd take Maggie Smith and a hunchback uncle over bologna sandwiches and bus rides any day of the week. But I think, even though I may not have been consciously thinking about the secret garden, it really was a formative part of my development, of who I am today. Now I have my own secret garden, my own little magic place, all tucked away and jam-packed full of wildflowers. It might not be Misselthwaite Manor, but it's mine. There is truly something magical in just observing the seasons pass, watching how everything changes, the cycle of death and rebirth. And it attracts company as well. Birds and butterflies and weird bugs that I've never seen before. If you're lonely but don't want to deal with humans, I highly recommend a garden. It has healed me in ways that I never thought possible, and as the first flowers of spring start to bloom, I find that I am filled with the same wonder that Mary had upon discovering her own secret garden. It's about learning to see the world through the lens of beauty and life, existing and persisting, even in the most unlikely, neglected, and inhospitable of places. Other than just aesthetically, I think there's a good reason that this movie still holds up today. Sometimes we are orphaned by a world that we just assumed would take care of us, at least in a reasonably tolerable way. It's a creeping realization that physically being a grown-up doesn't just automatically make the world make sense, and that all of the other grown-ups were just pretending that they knew what they were doing all along. There are a few little girls living in my neighborhood who like to sneak up to my house and pluck flowers out of my garden. They look so joyful when they do it, how could I get mad? I hope it inspires them, even if it's just to inspire them to be wild and free. I don't envy them growing up in today's world. Things seem so much more complicated, and the world seems not to be made to protect that innocent space that is childhood. Things today also seem a lot less romantic and safe than the world of the secret garden. Although back then, little poor kids would be shoved up chimneys and be losing limbs in a factory, so it seems like childhood has really always been rather precarious. And it seems like parents now are just as self-centered as Lord Craven was. I think the saddest thing about the secret garden is that he didn't see his grief could only be softened by the love of his own son, a real part of his beloved wife that would live on. I wish that I could go through the screen and slap some sense into that man, so that the children wouldn't feel like they were obligated to do magic in order to get his attention. In conclusion, I highly recommend watching or rewatching this movie, especially if you're in a cozy mood. The themes of isolation and trauma feel so true to a child's experience. I feel like modern kids would be able to relate to it. Children are certainly no less isolated today, maybe even more so. This movie may not be action-packed, but there's a lot to be said for slower films that leave room for emotional depth and a real feeling of wonder and exploration. Our collective attention span has never been shorter, and quieting our minds has never felt more excruciating. But this movie was like a little brain refresher. It's not a perfect movie. The child acting can be a little much sometimes, but just embrace the corny goodness and let yourself relax and enjoy something without being overly cynical, which is easier said than done when so much media is made to inflame those feelings nowadays. It's a sweet movie that might be a balm for some of our own childhood wounds that may not have gotten the happy ending that it should have, or at least it was for me. So get out there and look for, or even create, your own little secret gardens, especially if it feels unfriendly and unwelcoming in the world and lonely, because those little gardens, that little magic, will attract more magic, which is what the world sorely needs right now. Thank you so much for watching.